Welcome to the RecoverU podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
From sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. Hey everyone, quick note. I wanted to apologize before you listen to this episode that the sound quality is not the level that it usually is. I made a little tweak and did not realize until after we recorded the episode that it was not the most helpful tweak. So I do hope that it's not too distracting and that you're able to still enjoy the episode. Thank you so much for your patience, and we will see you next week. Welcome to another episode of RecoverU. I'm here, Kylene, with
Patrick.
And today we are going to talk.
I want to welcome you to the podcast. Nobody ever welcomes you to the podcast, Kylene.
So welcome.
Yeah.
So love.
Yep.
And we welcome all of you.
Yeah.
We welcome ourselves.
Selves are welcomed.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Everyone's welcome.
Everyone's welcome.
So today we are going to discuss the simple yet complex topic of sobriety versus recovery. And we are going to, it's one of the things that comes up a lot in the questions when I'm coaching betrayed spouses, and they have a lot of questions about some of the behaviors that they are seeing or are not seeing, what the process looks like. And so I end up sort of like breaking down. And I will say, I think, I could be wrong on this. I think a lot of this is my personal perspective. Like, this is the way I very clearly define it for my life, our relationship, and this is how I help my clients think about it. So I do sort of want a blanket statement that people, even professionals, have different perspectives on this than we do, and that's totally okay. This is one of those, you might call it controversial takes that we have. I do think it's an important one, and that's one of the reasons, like one of the things that we're going to talk about in this. I think defining it clearly can actually provide structure and motivation for someone to keep going when it's difficult. So we can kind of talk about that in the context of the definitions themselves. But if you disagree with us, or if your therapist disagrees with us, that's okay. Like, you don't have to land on the same page as we are, but we're going to share our perspective on this, how we view it, and hope that it's helpful. Before we jump into the episode, however, we have two things to talk about. One is we would really, really love your feedback as we continue to personalize and improve the podcast. So I have a very, and I mean very, very, very short survey. It's easy to take. It's a couple questions, things like, episode length, right? We typically average about 45 minutes. Is that cool with you? Do you like that? Is that your general length of a podcast that you like to listen to? Or would it just be so much better in your life if you could have shorter episodes? Or, maybe you'd like a mix. I didn't put that on there, but there's a space where you can kind of throw anything out there. And if that's something you'd be interested in, you can type that in. And we have some different things that we've listed out about what would you like to see more of, what are your thoughts on when we have people that we interview on the podcast versus just us, asking you if there are any specific topics you'd like for us to cover or even revisit. So all of that is open. There's a link in the show notes. It is anonymous unless you include your email at the end or your name in it. So I can't see who you are if you don't want me to, but you can go ahead and fill that out, and that would just be really helpful as we continue to think through what episodes we want to bring to 2025.
Like, one of the important questions is, who's your favorite podcast host? Is it me or is it you?
You mean me or Kylene?
Oh, yeah.
Is it Patrick or Kylene? Please do not write that in there. That would hurt one of our feelings. Okay. The second topic, thank you, is that how many days ago was that? I don't know, last week. Patrick passed his fifth polygraph. Yep. So it was, I obviously did the one before the full therapeutic disclosure. And so those questions were slightly different. And then I have taken annual polygraphs since. So the first year. So while we're coming up on we're wrapping up our 4th year in recovery. There's 5 polygraphs.
Yeah. So, I've gone to the same polygrapher. We would ultimately like to have him on this podcast because he's a pretty cool guy. But the emotions that come over me, as obviously I'm very happy that I pass it, right? You don't want to, and I think there's always a lot of people that worry about, was this going to be a false positive? They look at Hollywood and stuff like that. But the polygraphs are pretty good. I mean, they're used extensively in like law enforcement and things like that for hiring and stuff like that.
Are executed well.
Yeah.
And the guy that we use is very good.
Yep.
And they need, like, I've heard stories though where like for example, he asks you to get rid of your phone, take off your watch, like all that kind of stuff. So there's no buzzing, there's no interruptions. It's a very calm space. There have been situations I've heard of where like that hasn't happened. The polygrapher themselves is somewhat aggressive and like makes the person uncomfortable. Like those are not what we're talking about. Like it needs to be carefully done with someone who's good at what they do. And actually I just this past week went through and updated all of the show note episodes. So by the way, if you are a short time or a long time listener and you want to scroll through all those, they should be updated now with more specifics to what the episodes are. But while I was doing that, it really was like, oh, we've talked a lot about this stuff and we haven't talked about, these topics very much, because it helped me to sort of like itemize, right? Mm-hmm. So polygraphs is one that I think we've mentioned it a lot, but I thought we even had like a whole episode on it, and maybe we talked about it a lot in one of the early episodes, but like there was not even a title, I don't think, that was just about the polygraph. So I was surprised about that. I thought we had a whole episode on it, but we definitely need to do that in the future.
Yeah. It's so the way this polygrapher does it is there's 4 questions max. That might be standard for all polygraphs. I don't know. Yeah, but he does 4 questions and 4 questions only. And so we've had the same questions essentially for the last 4 polygraphs, except with the exception of the first one, which that one had a question on it that, to the best of your ability, have you told me everything?
So that one, except for the first, you meant except for the polygraph last year.
Well,
so the very first polygraph had some different questions specific to like the disclosure and stuff like that, right? It was very specific towards that time. And then the follow up, the last 4 polygraphs have essentially all been the same, except that last year I reworded some things and I added a question in there. That was the only one that was different. The rest of them were the same.
Yeah. So anyway, the way my mind always works, it's kind of like a major event. And I actually said this too, and this is not taken away from anybody who's had cancer or whatever. But I've gone through this. I actually had a biopsy done one time, and you had to go back and get the answer and stuff like that. But I was telling Kylene before I went last week, I was like, it's a lot like going to an oncologist. You don't know how it's going to turn out. Like you feel good. Like I felt very confident in my truth and, reading the questions, but there's always just a little bit of doubt and a little bit of uncertainty there. And you don't want something to go awry or whatever like that. So I'm always a little bit nervous when I get there. And I think part of it is because, the consequences are big. It's something that we've worked very hard to do to get into recovery and recover our relationship. We're still working on that, but I didn't want something like a weird polygraph result to to kind of derail us or whatever. And so what's interesting for me, and I'll kind of let you know what the way they go for me. So the polygrapher is very nice. He kind of talks to you, kind of calms you down, that sort of thing. And then you go into it and
he asks questions in different orders. He has you lie about some of them.
Right. Yeah. So, but what's interesting in my mind, I've always been able, for the most part, to draw on a comforting image. And so this time it was like the image of Jesus in there with me, and he kind of had his hand on my leg saying, hey, you're going to get through this. And so it calmed me down. It kind of calms your nerves down. And if you're nervous in a polygraph, that doesn't mean you're going to fail it, because nerves are just a normal part of it. But it's always nice to walk out of there, especially coming up on 4 years, and say, I can live a life of integrity. That's and it can be independently verified, which is kind of an interesting thing too. But so it was nice. I mean, it's nice to have it done for the next, till at such time, we decide to do another one. So, but that's certainly up to Kylene on that.
Yeah, I said that I kind of released the flexibility a little bit on that. He texted me that he had passed, and I said, "Good, make sure you give Dan a hug. It might be the last time you see him." And he was like, "Wait, what?"
Yeah.
I didn't want to talk about it ahead of time because I was like, last time there was a little bit of a blip because I had reworded something, and it was mostly the question, not
Right.
It wasn't like he wasn't trying to be deceptive. It was just the way it was a bad question. And so I was like, I really just wanted like a solid pass before we kind of moved on. So that was nice.
Yep.
How do you feel about it?
I feel good. It's there's a lot of thankfulness that's roped up in it. Obviously, there's the notion of pass fail, right? We all want to pass. But there's a lot of like thankfulness that's roped up in it. Through this process, Kylene was texting me. She's like, I know you're going to do good. And it's just really encouraging things. And, you certainly don't need to do that. Right. And everything. So that, that's really nice. And it always leads to a couple days of being a little bit more emotional than and appreciative, for me when I pass these things. And so I think it's just a reminder of where I was and how, I was in denial and lying to myself and lying to those around me and all of those things about what my problems were and what my level of behavior was and all of that stuff. And so to get to a point in my life now, in light of all of that, being able to pass a polygraph, that kind of speaks to the very root of what I had done. And so it means a lot. It really does mean a lot. It's a big deal. It's a big deal.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump into the topic, sobriety versus recovery. So again, some of you might be like, wait, isn't this the same thing? Some of you might already have your own definitions for this. And I am going to encourage you, by the way, but one of the things I do tell my clients, kind of when they're trying to figure out, like, how do I set boundaries? Where do we go from here? Like, what, after I just found out all this information, what do I do? One of the things I do recommend is that they define very clearly what like relapse is for them, right? And so that's also, I think, a little bit going to go into like, what is sobriety? What is recovery? Like, you have to make sure that these are things that in your mind are very clear. And today we're going to talk about our version of that. So if I had to make it super, super, super succinct, sobriety is I don't do the behavior anymore. Recovery is I don't do the behavior. I know that I've worked on the reasons I did the behavior, and I'm pretty confident, if not totally confident, that I'll never do it again because I keep doing the things that help me grow as a person so that I no longer need coping mechanisms. So sobriety is like, I'm not engaging in this negative coping mechanism. I'm not doing this thing that's hurtful anymore currently, right? But maybe tomorrow I might, maybe next month I might, or maybe I feel really, really good, but maybe the work hasn't been done. And 2 years later, there's a stressful event and there's a relapse, right? That's kind of the way I view sobriety. And it's not that a lot of great work can't be done in sobriety, but the difference to me between sobriety and like deep recovery is when there's a lot of heart change, a lot of head, like a lot of education, and like the way you think about things and the way you view the world changes. And then like the idea of recovery is that I'm actually in freedom. Like, I'm not stressed out that I'm going to relapse tomorrow. I'm not worried about it. Like, I don't view it in a way that, it has any sort of hold on me whatsoever. And I also realized that recovery, the way I think about, Patrick and I were talking about this before the episode, is recovery is like a living state. So once you get into recovery, I don't think you can really go, I'm in recovery, therefore I never have to like do anything again. I can just sit here and everything will be okay. I think if you just sit there, you can get back into sobriety and maybe struggle with relapse, or maybe you don't relapse, but you're really struggling with how to navigate stress, right? Recovery is like, I have this sense of like freedom. I really abhor the behavior that I used to engage in. I don't want to do that anymore. I personally have changed as a person. And I think one of the things like we talk about a lot on the podcast is like identity, right? What we don't want your identity to be is as an addict, right? That's a negative identity. What we do want your identity to be is as somebody in recovery. And when you identify as somebody that is in recovery, then you identify with all the thoughts and the behaviors and the desires of someone that lives actively in a continued living state of recovery. And that means, and that indicates, and that suggests that you're going to continue doing a lot of the work. It just morphs over time. So while in the beginning stages, it is more about the behavior itself and not doing it, or, avoiding certain things or whatever. Over time, the same tools, the same resources, the same exercises, the same thinking practices, the same behaviors that help you get into recovery now help you to just reflect on a deeper level about who you want to be, about your identity, about your emotions, about your goals in life, about all these different things. And you become more and more and more and more self-aware in a healthy, balanced way. And ultimately, that might sound like a little bit of work, but and I guess to an extent it is, but that's freedom, right? It's like the freedom that you get when you, and Patrick has talked about this, when you just have confidence that I'm going to make the right decision, even if I'm in a stressful time.
The very first opening screen of Conquer, the very first video says men can achieve sobriety in 90 days, but it takes 3 to 5 years to fully recover. So and I'm paraphrasing that a little bit, but essentially what they're saying is you can get to the point with the right amount of guardrails and locking things down and doing all of that so you're not engaging in the behavior. But the 3 to 5 years is you have to go through a section of life where there are stressors, external stressors, maybe health issues, maybe whatever that is that comes on you that creates that activates those traumatic wounds that you have. And you have to process through them. You have to say, okay, what does this mean to me today? What is it, for those of you who are in marriages that are struggling, it very well could be as the addict that your partner says, okay, I'm done. And they leave. And that's going to really challenge your recovery because you may go, well, why am I doing this or whatever? But if you're committed to recovery, you're going to continue to move through that. We've had some pretty difficult periods in our relationship over the past 4 years. It never created a stumble for me as far as that goes. But my point being is that those are dramatic challenges to your psyche that can derail your path towards recovery. One of the things I was thinking about as you were talking, I've talked about this before, and it's a pretty significant tool. And Pure Desire has an example of it, is the 3 circles tool. So early on, your red circle, or the red behaviors you're trying to avoid right out of discovery or right at the beginning of your healing path, are things like looking at pornography, maybe engaging in the affair. And those things are very clear cut, and they are related to your previous behaviors. But as you move further and further into recovery, a red circle behavior could be, I don't know, I want to think of something that's not necessarily pornographic. Yeah, not being empathetic, or maybe not paying attention to the TV. Maybe you're zoning out a little bit. You're not as aware of what's on there. Like you start a movie without checking what Common Sense Media says, right? I've heard of that. Sometimes people will say that. It surprises them. I'm like, well, it doesn't mean that you were necessarily seeking out anything negative. You just weren't prepared. And that could be a red circle activity that as you move further into recovery, that you adjust those as you grow. You develop greater empathy. I've heard people talk about people who are alcoholics and like, okay, for the rest of your life, you're going to have to be aware of it. Now, it doesn't mean that you shriek if you go to a party and there's alcohol there, that you shriek and run out of the building. It just means you're aware. And so the same thing happens in this particular thing is you spend the rest of your life, you're aware, you're honest about what your previous behaviors were, and you're aware of what it takes to navigate through life. And you were talking about me. I think that's what came to me is like, I was going through this step-by-step method of don't do this, don't do that, engage in this positive behavior. And then it started to just lighten up. Like the edges got really fuzzy because it was like, no, now you've reached a large degree of awareness, and you just kind of navigate almost like you're a boat going down a river. You're just with a very experienced captain, as opposed to a novice. And so you know exactly where you're going. You know where the shallow shoals are and all those different things. And so I think it's a that's the notion of recovery. Now I think, and I don't want to steal your thunder here, and if I do, forgive me. But the question would be, well, if I relapse, am I still in sobriety or am I still in recovery? That's always like the next magical question, because I will hear people say, "Yeah, I'm still in recovery, but I relapsed last week," and so you have to define things clearly. You have to go through that, and you have to say, hey, if you chose to go all the way back, right? Let's say you're 2 years or 10 years or 15 years into recovery, and you choose to go all the way back to your previous behavior of what was, the behavior that you really, really didn't want, then I would argue that you weren't in recovery because you hadn't put adequate guardrails up. You hadn't taken the process seriously. By contrast, if you say, I've been wanting to develop greater empathy, and yesterday I didn't have the best level of empathy, you could still be in recovery. It just means that you have, well, what I'm saying is because we all will go through periods of time where maybe we don't react to a situation. So it's like, you weren't an addict, but I can't go, well, you're not in recovery because you weren't as empathetic to your sisters. You're like, well, wait a minute, I was never an addict. You know what I mean? So I guess my point is like,
we're all human beings.
Right.
There's ups and downs in life.
Mm-hmm.
And recovery doesn't mean you're a perfect person.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So you're going to go through those things.
So both can be true, that there's a lot of incredible work that can happen in the sobriety phase, and people in recovery aren't perfect people.
That's right.
So both of those can be true, but we still want to get you into recovery. To that point, though, I do want to clarify, because when you come into the definition of how you define recovery, someone can be very, very, very sober, to your point, with the behavior itself. But if you're not seeing any of the work being done about, well, why did I do this? How do I manage stress? How do I understand my emotions? If they're not learning how to empathize with their partner and understand about trauma and understand how you feel as the betrayed partner, I would argue in a lot of ways that they are stuck in sobriety, even if they've not done the actual behavior itself for a really, really long time. And a lot of people would jump onto the word recovery at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But if nothing other than the behavior itself has changed, then that to me, that's a little bit difficult to define as recovery, because to me, recovery means my identity is different. And when your identity is different and you think about how do you view the world differently, if you still look at that behavior and are going, well, I'm just not engaging in it anymore, and that's the only thing in my life that has changed, that's not like deep, deep recovery. Because I think you could coincide the two words recovery and transformation very well together. There's a deep transformation that comes from a heart in deep recovery. And that's why it's a progressive thing. Most of the time, it would be extremely rare that would happen overnight. Like super, super rare. Like almost never. Almost always, it's a progressive thing. Sobriety can happen overnight, and that can happen a lot. That can happen instantly.
It happens with alcohol and drugs too. It'll happen overnight. Yeah.
The recovery aspect is such a mental health piece. It's an emotional awareness piece. It's a self-reflection piece. And I think some of both aspects of it, sobriety and recovery, both take hard work. It's just a different kind of hard work, right? So sobriety in the beginning feels very difficult because it is. You're detoxing from brain chemicals. You are having to navigate the stress of discovery or confession, whichever it was for you. You're having to navigate the stress of not having your coping mechanism while trying to think clearly, even though your brain isn't reset yet, while trying to navigate the stress of your partner. I mean, there's just a lot that's going on in the first couple months of sobriety. It's really difficult mentally, emotionally, physically, chemically, like everything in your brain and body is like, freaking out to an extent, right? Even if you hated the behavior and didn't want to do it, getting into sobriety and having everything shift in your brain and in your life and having fear come up about, discovery and talking to people about this, probably for the first time ever, it's just hard. That's hard work. So sometimes what can happen is when we get to a certain point of sobriety, it can feel so good. Okay, that hard part's over. The chemical shifting has balanced out. I'm not feeling withdrawal. I'm not feeling triggered. I don't really want to go back to that behavior anymore. Everything's feeling more calm in my body and my mind. I'm going to therapy or I'm going to group or whatever it is, and everything just feels better. And you start to see like the happiness of sobriety, right? And that can hit people at different times, but it's like just the peace of doing the right thing. That's a very attractive thing to go, I'm better, I'm fine, I don't need to do any work because I feel so good. Why would I ever go back to that? But what we see often is that that's very much a trick, because the deeper work of understanding, how did I get to that place in the first place? And how do I never get back there again when hard things come up? That's where recovery, the door is opened for recovery, is when you start doing that work. And we always encourage gold standard, right? That you're working with a therapist that's really good at this one-on-one, and that you're in a group that's really clear on the idea of that you can be free of this and that sort of thing. But I do want to just put a little asterisk here. Like, let's say finances are just really tight and therapy is not an option. Can somebody get in deep recovery with a good group and with their own research and with their own personal focus and education? Absolutely. And so there are groups, like we've mentioned often, like the Conquer group from Soul Refiner and Pure Desire. And if somebody does every single step in that, and takes the time for their own personal self-reflection, that's one of the biggest things, is like with addiction. I talk to so many betrayed partners, and they will share different interactions or different behaviors. And what I've noticed over time is almost every addict, if not every addict, that I've become aware of, shares similarities with like avoidant personality, right? And that means that in the most simplistic way of explaining that basically sitting in any sort of discomfort for any period of time, mentally or emotionally or conversationally, is overwhelming, is hard, and they don't want to do it because they don't have the tools and the resources to know that it's okay, know how to handle that, know how to navigate that in a way where it doesn't feel just really scary and overwhelming. And so with recovery, like that's part of the process. If you go through something where you are practicing sitting with your emotions and you're taking the advice in a group and you're reading all of the materials, maybe multiple times, and you're doing every piece of the homework and you're taking the time to do the internal self-reflection, that I feel like there's a lot of resistance sometimes with that. Maybe even on a like deep subconscious level for people, because it's uncomfortable. But that's kind of why we want to talk about this, is because that's the point. Mm-hmm. That's the hard part of the recovery. We talked about how difficult it is to get in sobriety. 90 days might seem like an eternity when you're in that pain point, like for real, that's excruciatingly hard because it's so overwhelming. But then you succeed, right? And so then there's like a little bit of a, I don't want to do that again. Well, no, but there's a parallel when you start getting into recovery, that now you have to sort of start peeling back the onion. And it doesn't necessarily have to feel as overwhelming as getting into sobriety did, but I want you to be very, very aware that moving through recovery does require discomfort. And so that is important to know, that recovery doesn't mean avoiding discomfort at all. It means learning how to navigate it without feeling super overwhelmed and afraid.
One of the things that Patrick Carnes talks about is in his books. He has the 30 tasks of healing from sex addiction. And there's 30. It's not one. It's not, hey, don't do the behavior anymore. So, and within that, when you look at all of them, they're all very, there's so many of them that are very relational. There are so many of them that are like making amends, developing a financial plan, all of these different things, because it's about going through that process. And you can't do those 30 tasks in 90 days. You just can't. It just doesn't work that way. So it's interesting about the work of recovery and how you keep moving. I was a lot of the guys, and I did too. You talked about counting the 90 days. I developed some counters, and I think for the first year I did it in quarters. I checked off dates. Sometimes for some people that can take on a life of its own, the counting thing, and it can be like, well, do you think this is did this disrupt my count or whatever? And so if that's you, if counting takes on a very obsessive, maybe don't count. Now, if you use things like the Freedom Fight app that counts your check-ins and your check-in streaks, that's just part of the app, and the app itself actually provides wonderful content for you, along with a faster scale and a journaling prompt and things like that. But that's one of the things that I've seen with folks is they'll get a little obsessed with the days, as opposed to understanding, like, hey, what you're trying to do is do good work every day, and then those days will compound. They'll add on to each other. I know myself, I'm surprised now by how many days. I'm like, oh my gosh, wow, that's a lot of days. You know what I mean?
Play different roles for different people.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I participated with you in the counting for a little while. So, that is something that you can sort of bring your partner into if you want to be involved in the process. But in my mind, I think for everyone, the first 90 days is important to count. I think it's really important,
right?
Because it's such a milestone. And what we want to do through this process is have these success points for you. Mm-hmm. These little positive dopamine hits, these positive reinforcements where it's like, oh my gosh, I did something that for the past 10 years of my life, I didn't think I was capable of achieving.
Right.
Think about the first time you earned a degree that you worked really hard for, or you went back to school in order to complete a degree that, life derailed you for a little while, or you accomplished something that you got, a raise for, or whatever it is, like some sort of success point in your life, right? And there's at least one point in your life where either that was hard to accomplish or that you thought you might never get to. And so what we want to do during recovery is actually create those opportunities for you, mm-hmm. right? And so the 90-day point is huge because I think, and you can tell me from your side living through it, how good that would feel to know that the science backs up that you are now, it's going to be easier for you to make good choices after that point. Right, if you've made it that far. Yeah. That now you can know that if you've made it 90 days, you can 100% make it longer.
That's right. Yeah. I remember, I think it was when I was tracking in secret before discovery, like how many days I'd gone. I think 11 was the high, 9 to 11, somewhere in there was like it wasn't very long. And so I remember that when I was counting and like I went past those days and it was starting, the light bulb was starting to come on, like, hey, I can do this. I can do it with help. I need help. And then when you hit the 90 days and the year and you've done a great job of giving me like 90-day coins and 6-month coins and year, it's kind of cool now. It's like, I've actually got kind of those and a couple other things lined up on my vanity in the bathroom. It's just a really, really, really nice thing. But the achievement or the willingness to make it, and then also be clear on what is a relapse, what is a slip, what's the other word? There's 3 words: slip, relapse, tripped up. I don't know. That doesn't sound right. Okay. So I think
you're thinking about like the green, yellow, red.
Yeah. Sorry. So, but I think being able to adequately, early on, you don't do a good job of defining what that is. Maybe other than like, oh, if I look at pornography, it's a bad thing. But it's like, there are a lot of other behaviors that could be gateway behaviors to it, even from an inappropriate standpoint, but maybe aren't as inappropriate as what you were doing. You know what I mean? But are still like, if, it's like that standard, like if you were sitting next to me and saw what I was doing, would you approve or disapprove? You know what I mean? Like one of those sorts of things, even if it wasn't pornography, you'd be like, hey, why are you looking at that? You know what I mean? That sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done within that to understand, hey, how do I define a slip? How do I define a relapse? You know what I mean? Those are all really, is lying to your partner, is that a relapse? That could be a relapse because, through the periods of recovery, not necessarily, but that's something that you would define with your partner.
You had brought up alcoholism earlier, and I think it's always such a good example just because people societally are so much more familiar with the idea of recovery around alcoholism. And something that sort of came to mind is the idea that, we first of all believe that alcoholics can 100% recover. And we actually see quite often that people that used to struggle with alcoholism can now be around alcohol and not be tempted. I mean, I'm sure it's few and far between, but you've always heard the stories too of like, well, there's some alcoholics that own bars now and never drink, right? Like it's so there's the ability to, and if you think about that, think about how when someone that has a sex or porn addiction gets into deep recovery, in some ways, once you get to that point, it would almost be easier than an alcoholic because you're not going to accidentally drop into a strip club, right? But if you're an alcoholic, you're going to go out to dinner with somebody and maybe 5 people at your table may order drinks, and that's going to be right in front of you, right? But as somebody that's recovered from sex or porn addiction, like you're not going to necessarily, the website doesn't drop in your lap.
Right.
Now there's other examples of, people going into the real world and objectifying other humans, and that's a little bit of a different, a little bit more parallel to the alcoholism where it's like, okay, how do you learn as part of recovery to humanize everyone around you to the point where that's also not an issue and you just move through the world in a safe, healthy way?
Well, I think that comes up in your 3 circles tool. Like if you're really practicing awareness, are you like, I've actually been, I've been noticing women more. What does that mean? I haven't done anything inappropriate yet, but I'm, where does that fall in my 3 circles? Is this, something, do I need to go in and I need to get some things cleaned up, or do I need to understand why all of a sudden this became something that showed up in my behavior? You know what I mean? And so those things, I think you're right. That's just an indicator of, hey, you've got to do a little bit more work. You've got to understand where it is. I was actually, we over the Christmas holiday, I was not very nice to you on Christmas Eve. And one of the things, it was actually something that Nick Stumbo said in his final end of year podcast that really made me think through this. And it was a disagreement we had, but I could have handled it much better than I always do. And one of the things he mentioned was like, do you behave in light of the fruits of the Spirit? And the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And so it's really kind of resonated with me this year as I started leading groups again. It's like, just because those are the fruits of the Spirit doesn't mean we always get it right. But when we don't get it right, what does that mean? What does it mean that particular thing had a reaction out of you that was counter to the fruits of the Spirit? You know what I mean? What's going on that maybe is it a wound that was rubbed up against, or was it a fear, or whatever that is? And so it's just, it's a really, when we're talking about moving into deep recovery, I think, all those things that I mentioned there, like if everybody in your life demonstrated all of those things on a daily basis, imagine how happy we would all be. You know what I mean? And so, but we're not going to get there because it's just the nature of the world, and stuff like that. But it's a great goal. It's a great goal to push forward and say, hey, am I demonstrating this? And if not, why not?
I agree. When you think about, as you were talking, I was thinking about like from a spiritual perspective, you could also think about recovery as the process of sanctification.
Mm-hmm.
So that it's not really happening when you're like living in active addiction, right? You're not constantly growing. You're very, very stuck. But the process of recovery, the living state of recovery, is like this ongoing process of sanctification. As a singer, when I was going through lessons for years and decades and everything, it's like one of those, and this happens in all, I'm assuming every industry. The better you become at something, the more flaws you could see. Mm-hmm. And in my case, like the more you learn about the voice, and the more you learn to get better at it, the more you can hear. I need to improve this. I need to improve this. I need to improve this. Right. And so as you go through recovery, it's like this growth process, the sanctification process, and you move further and further away. It's like if you are using the same example, you get to a level of singing where you do pretty well, right? And you're not even close to where you started, but now you hear all this stuff you didn't even hear, like in the beginning, you thought you were pretty good, right? Like the first time you go to a voice lesson, you're like, I'm awesome. And then you like learn and improve. And then you get really, really good. And you're like, man, that wasn't very good, right? And so it's like this idea that the more self-aware you become, the more knowledgeable you become, the more you learn about the world and yourself, the more you become aware that you have parts of you that need to keep growing and parts of you that need to keep improving and things that you need to keep learning, right? It's like the more knowledge you have, the more you're aware of the lack of knowledge that you have.
I was actually thinking there was an example that happened with me when I was cooking, and I'm not sure if you recall this, but it wasn't too long ago. So when I was in active addiction, I would lie to you. I would actually actively lie to you about what was happening. And then, so, you go through this process, and I've had to reconcile that with you. And, we've gone through this process. I was cooking something, and the process was a little complicated. And you had said just in passing, hey, did you wash that? It was a food thing. And it was just a confusing process. And I was like, yeah. And then I think it was the next day, it struck me. I was like, actually, no, I didn't wash that. So I came and I told you, I said, hey, you asked me yesterday if I washed that. At the time I said I did, but I was confused. I just wanted to clarify. I did not wash that. And so I kind of felt bad. I was like, you know what I mean? And so that's what's interesting is I bet I could almost probably argue that I would not have corrected that in years past, because it would have been like, no harm, whatever. You know what I mean? It would have been like, who cares?
That specific example up, and then you said that at the end about you probably would not, because it compared to everything else that you're doing, you'd be like, who cares, right?
Right. So low impact. Right.
So low impact, and the reason I'm glad you brought that up is because part of the addiction patterns is the self-qualifying, the self-denial of the reality, and I think that's why sometimes it's so shocking for the betrayed partner to end up learning everything that's happened, because we're not in that level of denial. We haven't qualified and manipulated the truth to come to an understanding that we feel okay about. We're just showed the truth, or we discover the truth, and all of a sudden it's like, when it's hit in the light of reality, it's a lot to process. Right. And so when you think about the difference between sobriety versus recovery, someone that's in sobriety, again, even if they're not engaging in the behavior itself, may still be engaging in a lot of denial, a lot of internal manipulation, a lot of blaming or gaslighting or lack of empathy. They may have shifted their coping mechanism to be a different kind of an outlet, right? And so you want to make sure that is recovery, is becoming aware of those negative patterns, negative mental thought patterns, negative emotional patterns, negative behaviors. Recovery is like this process of, from a spiritual aspect, like you said, living into the fruits of the Spirit. From a non-spiritual aspect, it's basically learning how to day by day live life, because life is a stressful thing. It will never not be stressful. It's full of a lot of hard things. It's full of relationships. It's full of difficulty. So the process of recovery is, okay, I'm not doing that thing anymore, but how do I get better at expressing empathy? How do I get better at communication? How do I take responsibility for everything that I do in my life? On every level? To your point, did that, dramatically change my life that you told me that you wash it, and then you told me, oh, I caught myself, I didn't wash that? No, but did it, especially after betrayal, put, drop a coin in the bucket of rebuilding trust? Absolutely. Did it demonstrate integrity? 100%. Did it demonstrate change in thought processes and the way you view the world and the way you don't qualify things? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good response or example.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the other thing that's key here, and you and I had a long conversation about this before we started recording the podcast. Relapse is part of some people's journey. It just is. And we don't need to qualify it and call those people bad or other people good or whatever. Sometimes it's just a part of that. And I know sometimes people will say if you choose to relapse, right? They draw it into a choice. So I think it's really important to and I've seen both behaviors of this. We do check-ins in groups and people go, yeah, I had a hard week. I relapsed on Thursday. And you go, oh, okay, so what did we learn from that? Versus somebody else will say, you know what, I was having this go on and I found myself in a spot that I didn't want to be in, and boom, I relapsed. And these are the 6 steps I'm putting in place because I relapsed and because I don't want to go back there again. And I was unaware that I had this opening and that I hadn't resolved this yet and those sorts of things. So there is a very big difference between those 2 sets of behaviors. One indicates a real hard leaning towards a recovery mindset. And the other one is somebody who's not necessarily ready to move into sobriety and then doesn't fully understand what recovery is. And so they are very different things. And once again, sometimes that's part of people's recovery journey. And,
what we said earlier, it doesn't mean that this time that you spend in sobriety, there's not good positive change.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean that when people finally get into recovery that they're perfect every day of their life.
Right.
But it is that mindset piece. And so that's kind of what the point I was making when it comes to if the only thing that's changing is the behavior itself, that's definitely not recovery. That's definitely just sobriety.
Right.
There is a spectrum of sobriety. And I think that's kind of what you were just talking about, though. There's the early phases and the stuck phases where there's not a lot of work and maybe the behavior's not happening, but it's just nothing else is really changing. And then there's doing a ton of work and getting really close to recovery and having all of these mindset shifts and all this kind of stuff. And then maybe, dealing with stress isn't something that was really addressed, or maybe a specific trigger was never really addressed in therapy or in the group or personally. Maybe that person never really did the exercises to go back and go, okay, what were my specific patterns every single time I would act out for the 24 to 48 hours prior to the behavior itself. And then they didn't realize they didn't do that. And then 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. I mean, so many people have different stories around this. There's a relapse, and then they realized, oh my gosh, I never knew that XYZ was actually a trigger for me. Mm-hmm. I never identified that in my patterning. Now I can. Maybe for you, if that's your story, maybe that was the last unidentified piece of the puzzle for you.
That's right. In
that case, you were one step away from recovery. You put that last puzzle piece in it. You process that in a healthy way. You find a new way to address that in the future, and boom, you're in recovery and you're moving right along, right? So to be clear, defining these isn't really we certainly don't want to shame people that are in the sobriety phase. We do want to encourage you that recovery is possible. It does take work. It does take a lot of effort and time and self-reflection. But there are people that can be in sobriety, maybe that's you today, that listening, that is super close to recovery, and maybe hearing kind of the way we define these and some of the work that goes into how do you get there might help you kind of think through, okay, what's the next step for me to actually get there? Because I do want to live a life in freedom. I really don't want to think about this anymore, Mm-hmm. And if you're someone that doesn't want to think about it anymore, then I get that. The idea of doing all of this work is self-analyzing enough, and maybe analyzation isn't the right word, but processing enough, maybe that's a better word, processing enough that it truly, truly doesn't become an issue in the future. But it's like the stone in the shoe kind of thing. If we just build up a callus to it, what if the rock moves to another point in the foot? That's going to hurt.
Yeah. They say in Conquer that you don't recover unless you become daily aware. And so, that's really important. And I never tell people, hey, the best thing that you can do, the people who just don't do the behavior are the ones who recover. What I always say is are the people who do the work, the people who check in daily in their journals, the people who are really connecting with their faster scales and making their calls and doing the work that the course outlines for you. And you talked about reading. I know that I think there's every book except one that's referenced in the Conqueror I've read. And so it was just a way for me to continue to gain more knowledge about it. And so I think, because we have been educated by the world on, which is why we ended up going down the route we did with the behavior. Now we have an opportunity to learn another direction. And if you don't take that opportunity, to move into recovery, the world's going to take over again. And it's going to take over again pretty soon. So you need enough knowledge in your head so you can understand what's happening out there.
Yeah, but it goes back to the point of like the self-education, the self-healing. It can be done. If you have the ability to get the extra support, then we encourage that certainly, because it's going to make your journey easier. It's going to help clarify things a little more quickly. It can absolutely improve and support the process, but it does not mean on any level that it's not doable on your own with the affordable resources that are available to you. It is a combination of education and hard work, and that certainly can be done on your own. 100%. It just is going to take time and consistency and effort, and that deep self-reflection. And this is a totally separate episode, I think, but I do want to just throw it into this because it kind of ties into the whole concept. As a betrayed partner, all of these expectations that we have for the addict to do all of this work to get into recovery and to be this person of integrity, we have to make sure that as the spouse of that person and as a human being, we are checking off all of those boxes as well. That we are doing the work, that we are showing up in integrity, that we are taking responsibility for our behavior and our life and our recovery journey because of how painful this is, that we also choose to put the time and the effort in to make sure that we are, and I think that would be a different episode. For the addict, it's going to be sobriety versus recovery. For the betrayed, it's going to be stability versus recovery. So I think that is what we. Anything else to add about sobriety versus recovery?
No.
Okay, cool. So I do want to just wrap it up with two things that are going to be in the show notes today. We have the survey that we would love, so love and appreciate if you would fill that out, just asking a couple basic questions of how we can continue to improve this podcast for you, what you like about it, what you might like to hear us discuss in the future. And then I've also, like I mentioned earlier, I've gone back through and personalized the show notes for every episode of RecoverU. So that should make it easier if you're trying to find an episode that you have listened to in the past, or maybe you're new to RecoverU and you aren't sure what an episode is about based on the titles. The show notes have a lot of information now. Some of the episodes where we answer multiple questions, a lot of the questions are actually listed out in the show notes to help it be a little more clear, like what we're talking about, what we're answering, how that's going to help you. And so what I've done as I kind of went through this process, I also ended up creating a little RecoverU podcast cheat sheet. So it's really just a summary of what we have discussed in RecoverU. So if you are looking for episodes that talk about forgiveness, if you are looking for episodes that talk about rebuilding trust, if you are looking for episodes that talk about divorce, or episodes about parenting, episodes about specific tools and recovery exercises for the addict to support them into getting into recovery, all of those are listed out and more. There's a lot of different subject headings, and then I put a lot of episodes that we've covered those topics underneath those headings. So those links to the quick survey, the feedback survey, and the RecoverU PDF cheat sheet that you can print out and keep and kind of look back to, that's updated up to fairly recent episodes. So if you're listening to this a year later, it might not be updated, but it's updated through about episodes like 94, 95, kind of right around this timeline. So I hope that that's helpful for you. I hope that just helps you navigate the podcast a little more easily, depending on where you are in your own journey, that it helps you find some resources, some encouragement, some answers to some questions. And we definitely hope that this episode has been encouraging to you. I hope that thinking about sobriety versus recovery in a little bit more specific terms as separate things, hopefully that has given you something to think about, given you something to maybe continue to work towards, and clarify the path to get there. We are so thankful for every single one of you, and we can't wait to talk to you next week.
Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with RecoverU. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.